Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us at the UN compound once again. It's a pleasure to be sitting here today with Pablo de Gref, who, as many of you know, is the Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparations and guarantees of non-reoccurrence. The format of the briefing will be as follows. Pablo will talk you through his statement, which will be available to all of you, and then open up the floor for questions and answers. If we could keep the questions relatively short, we try to take them one at a time. But if there's loads of questions, we'll maybe take 2 or 3 at a time. So thank you again for your attention, and I look forward to spending the next hour and a half with you.
Thank you very much, Una, and thank you very much to all of you for your willingness to come to this conversation. Because I think that accuracy on this topic is important. I will read a statement first. The text of the statement will be made available to you, and then we can have a question and answer period. I would be very happy to entertain questions. Ladies and gentlemen, today I conclude my 14-day official country visit to Sri Lanka. This visit completes a series of 4 previous trips to the country, for which I was invited by the government to provide advisory services. Hence, since March 2015, I have been able to regularly and closely follow developments. This visit, which will lead to a report to the Human Rights Council, comes at a particularly critical juncture in which determined decisions are called for. I hope to contribute to this process with my preliminary observations and recommendations, which I would like to share with you today. My 5 visits to the country manifest the openness and willingness to engage in constructive dialogue by the government, for which I would like to express my appreciation. Since my first visit in early 2015, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has provided me with extraordinary support, including by facilitating and organizing official meetings. I equally extend my thanks to the United Nations country team, its resident coordinator, as well as the Senior Human Rights Advisor in Colombo and his team for all the support during the visits. During this particular visit, I have been able to travel extensively throughout the country to hold discussions in Adugama, Jaffna, Kilinoshi, Manal, Matara, Mulaitibu, Kusalam, and Trincomalee, and visit emblematic locations in these districts related to violations, land issues, and memorialization. I had the opportunity to listen to victims and their families, some of which traveled from afar to share their experiences with me. In Colombo, I had the honor to be received by His Excellency the President of Sri Lanka and by the Prime Minister. I also had very productive discussions with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Finance and Media, the Minister of Law and Order, the Minister of National Coexistence, Dialogue and Official Languages, the Minister of Prison Reforms, Rehabilitation and Resettlement, the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Education, the Secretary to the President, the Secretary of Defense, the Chief of Defense Staff, and the commanders of the 3 forces and the intelligence services, the Honorable Speaker of Parliament and the Sectoral Oversight Committees on Legal Affairs and Media and Reconciliation and North and East Reconstruction, the Chief Justice, the Attorney General, the Inspector General of Police, the chairperson of the Victim and Witness Protection Authority, the Secretary General of the Secretariat for Coordinating Reconciliation Mechanisms, the Director General of the Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, the Human Rights Commission, the National Police Commission, members of religious communities, political parties, and representatives of the diplomatic community, academics, civil society organizations, victim groups, and many others who have shared their insights with me. At the local level, I had the opportunity to exchange views with the governors of the Northern Province and the Eastern Province. At the end of March 2015, I had the pleasure to undertake my first visit to Sri Lanka under the invitation of the then new government that had resolved to restore its tradition of strong engagement with the international community. This put an end to the temporary leave that Sri Lanka had taken from its international cooperation with the human rights architecture the country had contributed to and benefited from. Since then, that resolve has continued to be manifested in many ways, amongst others by engaging with various entities of the United Nations and by strengthening ties with a broad range of international actors, as well as with international civil society organizations. From the standpoint of my mandate, I will highlight not only the repeated invitations and the fruitful exchanges I have had in the course of multiple visits, but also the engagement of the government with other special procedures of the Human Rights Council, including the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, the Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Judges and Lawyers, the Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, and the Special Rapporteur on Countering Terrorism, all of which have made recommendations with which I concur. There is no question that because of its willingness to interact, Sri Lanka now has unprecedented levels of support in the international community. I would like now to mention some of the changes I have observed inside Sri Lanka since my first visit in 2015. I will concentrate only on developments related to my mandate, without pausing to remark on progress in other areas crucial to the future of the country, such as the 19th Amendment of the Constitution, among other initiatives. Regarding my area of concern, I will highlight the following. First, it is obvious that both civil society and parts of government have traveled on a very steep learning curve regarding transitional justice issues. Sri Lankan civil society, with its characteristic courage, persistence, and very high capacity, continues to be fully present, in my opinion, as an insufficiently tapped resource, making crucial contributions to transitional justice debates. The government of Sri Lanka has also successfully cultivated capacities on the topic, especially in the Secretariat for Coordinating the Reconciliation Mechanisms, CRM, and the different technical working groups that supported its mandate, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister's Office, among other places. These are crucial capacities as the country moves on to the design and implementation of a robust and comprehensive transitional justice policy, as it continues to reiterate it will. Second, a very important recent development was the establishment of the work of the Consultations Task Force on Reconciliation Mechanisms, the CTF. This task force was established by the government, but as you know, run entirely by members of civil society, displaying a degree of commitment that deserves to be celebrated. In an extraordinarily short period, without pre-existing structures, and sometimes only with limited support from some authorities, the CTF managed to establish its presence broadly and deeply in the country. Up to this point, this is the most comprehensive effort to capture the views of victims and others on transitional justice questions. While consultation should not be conceived of as a one-off experience, and mechanisms of ongoing consultation should be built into all future transitional justice measures. The CTF's report should have been better received, and its conclusions and recommendations should certainly be a part of all conversations regarding the design of those measures. The third observable change is that conversations about transitional justice have extended so as to include more stakeholders, including youth groups, academics, the media, Sri Lankans abroad, and the armed forces. Inclusive preparatory work will in the end be important for the sustainability of the process. Finally, I should also mention the progress achieved in the creation, after a long delay, of the Office of Missing Persons at the OMP. While the process was protracted and involved insufficient communication with the public, the law has been enacted. I was informed that the process of selecting commissioners has just started. I understand that this will involve accepting self-nominations from the public at large, which I think is a very positive development. It will be crucial for the Constitutional Council to select people that will bolster the credibility of the OMP by their moral standing and probity in the eyes of all communities, their expertise, their independence, and also the ability to collaborate and work expeditiously. The establishment of the OMP has taken a long time, despite being an arguably easy part of the transitional justice project. The urgency of clarifying the fate of the missing, I think, can be understood by everyone. Now, however, the fact that this list of achievements does not include most of the priority measures that I mentioned in the statement after my first visit in 2015 makes obvious that the process is nowhere close to where it should have been more than 2 years later. These expectations were not merely those of the international community, but of the government of Sri Lanka and of Sri Lankans generally. It was the government's 100-day program that made commitments to its people concerning accountability. Those commitments were then specified in greater detail in the Human Rights Resolution 30/1, co-sponsored by Sri Lanka, which won plaudits not just among the international community, but in Sri Lanka as well. The country committed itself to establishing in a 2-year period, which, by the way, lapsed in March of this year, measures on 4 different areas, including truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Let me emphasize one point. In a world in which nation-states are still the basic units of political organization, the human rights architecture that they collectively construct is first and foremost the expression of commitments to their own citizens, beyond the fact that they are voluntary players. Some of the pending issues I have mentioned in April 2015 included the release of land, the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the PTA, and its replacement by legislation that is fully compliant with human rights standards, the establishment of a mechanism to review expeditiously the cases of those held under the PTA, and the cessation of overbearing and intimidating forms of surveillance, especially against women, human rights activists, and those involved in memorialization initiatives in the North and East. Each of these issues involve questions of basic rights, and thus the continued failure to achieve progress in fully addressing them constitutes a denial of justice. Furthermore, the delays raise questions in many quarters about the determination of the government to undertake a comprehensive transitional justice program and undermine trust, which is not plentiful in this country, as demonstrated by continued incidents of inter-ethnic violence. Moreover, the delays have additional spillover consequences, and let me illustrate that. Although some of the land occupied by the armed forces, in some cases for decades, has been indeed returned, the lack of clarity and comprehensiveness in the process has serious consequences from a developmental standpoint. It speaks about a weak regime of property rights, one of the greatest imaginable disincentives for foreign investors, for whom reliable property rights is a sine qua non condition. Similarly, continued unnecessary surveillance both manifests and fuels low levels of trust, which not only makes reaching agreements more difficult, it also constitutes a developmental drag through effects that are similar to the reduction in market sizes and an increase in transaction costs. The fact that the judicial system is so backlogged and slow, with a recent study before Parliament suggesting out that some criminal cases often take more than 70 years to be resolved, only compounds the difficulties. There is a broad understanding of the fact that Sri Lanka faced in the past serious security challenges. Thus, Sri Lanka has not only the right but the obligation to provide security for all, compatible, of course, with human rights and other standards. Similarly, there is an understanding of the challenges faced by countries that attempt to face legacies of abuses, while they simultaneously engage in democratizing and ambitious constitutional reforms. However, in assessing where and when to attempt progress on the transitional justice agenda, the following considerations need to be kept in mind. As many other country experiences show, long delays between the acknowledgement of obligations to establish transitional justice measures and the fulfillment of these obligations involves some risks. No one should be under the impression that waiting is a costless alternative. Let me mention some of the costs and risks. First, it is usually the case that delays open up opportunities for the topic to become entangled in partisan politics, as it seems is happening in Sri Lanka. I take the opportunity to reiterate a point that cannot be overstated. Transitional justice deals with questions of basic fundamental rights. Hence, it is not to be reduced to a matter of partisan political contestation. Second, in a highly polarized context, the absence of a comprehensive plan that includes provisions for the satisfaction of the rights to truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence has left transitional justice as an easy target for attack. It has been narrowed to a discussion about one of its dimensions only, criminal accountability, and this topic further reduced to the question of the nationality of the judges in a future accountability mechanism. The third risk or cost is that the scope of transitional justice project has been reduced to events around the end of the conflict, when in fact it should have a much broader sweep in a country with a long history of cycles of violence. The absence of a comprehensive plan also means that transitional justice, already being present in public debates, generates apprehensions. Some of the fears, I must say, are the result of political manipulation of the topic. Others stem from a lack of concrete answers that may actually assuage some of those apprehensions. And finally, the politicization of the topic in this context has also meant that it has been increasingly ethnicized, As a result, transitional justice is represented as if it were essentially a threat to the majority community, of interest to one of the minorities only, and all the other minority groups left somewhere in the margins. In light of the risks associated with further delays, the lack of an informed debate proactively supported by government, including its top leadership, is difficult to understand. In this context, then, it may be worth offering the following reminders. A comprehensive transitional justice policy, including its 4 constitutive elements, truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence, if designed and implemented with inclusive participation, has the potential to provide recognition to victims, strengthen the rule of law, foster civic trust, and promote civic integration or reconciliation. Countries with legacies of authoritarianism and or conflict have gravitated towards transitional justice precisely for these reasons. In low trust contexts, typically in the aftermath of large-scale violations, where trust between citizens, among groups, and between them and state institutions has been shattered, policies meant to increase understanding about the conditions that led to the violations, to make narrow and reliable attributions of responsibility, offer diverse forms of reparation to victims, so as to contribute to their being able to resume at least part of their lives with an increased sense of well-being, and to reform institutions so that violations do not happen again, help to lay the foundations for increased trust. Transitional justice can achieve its potential only to the extent that it is not used as an instrument of turn-taking, a means to benefit one community over others, to further partisan political interests, to become in the end a complex form of patronage. The promotion and strengthening of human rights is at the core of the transitional justice program. That means the rights of all, independently of all other considerations, including ethnicity, religion, politics, gender, etc. While the events around the end of the conflict in 2009 merit particular examination, in a country with a long history of violations and of violence, in which all communities are victims, and where it would be a gross oversimplification and the product of manipulation, I must add, to reduce that history to its inter-community dimension, transitional justice might be especially useful. It should be recalled that the violence around the JDP insurrections and the LTTE violence against Tamils are examples of intra-communal violence, showing what we know to be the case, that wherever violations are tolerated, no one is safe, and that the violations tend to recur. Similarly, and as a consequence, it is worth recalling that this is a country in which every community has victims that have rights to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence. So, in addition to the Tamil victims during and at the end of the conflict, a quick list of victims that are still awaiting redress would include those of the insurrections mentioned above, the many victims of terrorist attacks, the family members of the over 600 policemen gruesomely murdered in 1990, and the Muslim population forced out of Jaffna in the same year. And this, of course, is nothing but an incomplete list. The point is that transitional justice measures, to the extent that they are instruments for strengthening the regime of rights, the rights of all may be particularly useful in a context with such a history. In February 2016, at the Human Rights Council, providing some comments of my visits to Sri Lanka, I argued the following. Those who approach questions of truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence as if they were the subject of a zero-sum game, a matter of interest to one community alone, do a great disservice to the country. This includes some politicians, some members of the media, and even some religious leaders who speak as if the measures will either target or benefit one group alone. I want to reiterate this point on this occasion. Transitional justice should be of interest, and in any case, it is meant to protect the rights of all. Transitional justice processes can help in settling interminable debates precisely of the sort that manifest and produce low levels of trust and that lend themselves easily to political manipulation. As I was writing this statement over the weekend, the debate continued in the newspapers, for example, concerning the numbers of victims at the end of the conflict, whether it was 40,000 or merely 8,000. While the final number may be impossible to determine with absolute precision, there is of course a lot that has been learned in the last 30 years about forensics and other methods offering reliability that political opinions, of course, cannot. Similarly, and I think that this is very important, transitional justice processes are nothing like witch hunts. They do not involve massive purges and do not trade on charges of collective responsibility or guilt by association. In this respect, I note with concern the use of rhetoric about war heroes never being brought to trial. This seems to me to misrepresent the target of transitional justice accountability measures by suggesting that it is a generally anti-security agenda, and also by forgetting that no one who has committed the violations of human rights or the loss of war deserves to be called a hero. Sifting precisely between the legitimate and lawful use of force and the contrary, under conditions in which all relevant due process guarantees are meticulously adhered to, and in which not only the rights of victims, but also the rights of suspects and of the accused are protected, is one of the points of transitional justice accountability. I will add that the promise mentioned above regarding war heroes is a legally unenforceable political statement and therefore cannot offer any real legal certainty. In order to make it effective, that promise would ultimately require a violation of the principle of the separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary, amongst others. Moreover, needless to say, it offers absolutely no warranty internationally. As the recent case presented in Brazil against a former member of the armed forces demonstrates, accountability will be sought either here or abroad. In my opinion, this is an additional reason for the country, with the full support of the armed forces, who stand a lot to gain from this process, to establish a robust and credible, comprehensive transitional justice policy. In the written version of the statement, I have, of course, included some concrete recommendations moving forward, and that for the sake of brevity, already violated, I would not present orally now. Both the analysis and the recommendations will receive further elaboration in the report to be presented to the Human Rights Council in September 2018. Thank you very much for your patience, and I am happy to respond to questions.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I believe that a few of those copies could be taken over here where they didn't get enough copies. Thanks. Okay, I'll take a couple of questions first, and then we hear from the Special Rapporteur, and then we take some more questions.
Well, I'm representing PFP. My question is a little out of the subject, but it is within the circle. Now, United States withdraw from UNESCO. Is there any bearing out of it to the transitional justice system in the United Nations?
Is there what? I'm sorry.
United States.
Yeah, no, I'm just the last part of the question.
Is there any bearing towards transitional justice system in the United Nations?
Not immediately, of course. I mean, I cannot respond for UNESCO, and in fact, as sort of, mandate holders of the special procedures act within the system under the capacity of independent experts. So we do not represent the system as a whole. I, of course, do not represent UNESCO. But I mean, just immediately, I don't think that there's an immediate direction to it.
Thank you.
Ranga from Reuters. Now, you mentioned that there is a delay in the process. So, how justifiable is the delay, and what is your level of patience?
So, thank you very much for your question. My patience, if I may start with the second part of your question, is the least of it. I think that what is important is first that this is a question having to do with the fundamental rights of the citizens of Sri Lanka, that delays in establishing the programs, the comprehensive programs of redress that the country has committed to, has very, very important consequences, including consequences that can be measured in terms of rights and justice. They arguably constitute in themselves a denial of justice. But additionally, I was arguing in the statement the delays bear some risks of further politicization of the discussion, of the increasing difficulties of finding consensus around this topic, but also in failing to accrue the benefits of making progress in this, which seem to me to be urgent in a context in which there are still lots of serious social divisions. As to the first part of your question about the justifiability of the delays, I don't think that the role of special procedures is to make judgments about probabilities. I think that the role of special procedures is twofold. One, to provide some tools for the verification of compliance with international obligations, underscoring that the international obligations, in my view, are the expression of commitments that countries undertake with their own citizens. And the second role of the special procedures is to offer some guidance about how to improve questions of compliance. So whether the delays are justified or not is not the subject of my analysis. I would like to urge the country to move forward with this program, both on account of its importance for the satisfaction of rights of victims, but also in order to start accruing very important benefits in terms of the increasing trust and confidence between communities, which seems to me to be an urgent task. Finally, I might add that there is an important additional point that is worth keeping in mind. This is a country that, whose history demonstrates that around every 10 years there has been a serious cycle of violence. It is absolutely imperative for the country to do whatever it can in order to break out of that pattern. And while, of course, this is not a question of probability either, and my role is not to make predictions, my role is to observe that countries that have left past human rights violations unaddressed stand at a higher chance of recurrence. And that therefore, not surprisingly, the fourth pillar of the mandate is called guarantees of non-recurrence, because the intent is to offer solutions to the repetition of those cycles of violence. Thank you.
I have a second question.
I actually have two people there at the back who are waiting, one person there, then I'll come here, and then we'll come back to you. Thank you. So,
Sulochana from today newspaper. I have two questions. One is, could you please explain or tell in brief what does the majority and the minority communities have to gain from the transitional justice process? One. And the second is, you have been in the north and you have seen the protests going on there. It is still ongoing protests over the release of the political prisoners. What's your views and stance on that?
okay, we'll take the question for the woman behind.
This is Meera from the Hindu. The government and the foreign ministry has, even before your visit, indicated in formal terms that they will not go by recommendations, or they are not obliged to carry forward recommendations that you might have. And this also brings the question of political will into focus. When you spoke on Friday, you said the political economy of transitional justice is of greater significance than the economy. So, in terms of political will, I know your role is not to recommend, but from your travels and your various meetings, what is the sense you're getting in terms of the kind of political will there is at the moment?
Okay, so let me take this. First, I will address the issue of the release of political prisoners. From my first visit in 2015, and that was March 2015, only 2 months after the elections, I made a point of insisting that it would be very important to establish an expeditious mechanism to review the cases of people that were imprisoned under the PTA legislation. I think that this is important because one of the criticisms that the PTA law had always been subjected to was that it not only relaxed far beyond what international best practice does, evidentiary criteria, but that in many ways, because it allowed cases to be resolved solely on the basis of confessions, and confessions that it was suspected were acquired under conditions of coercion in many circumstances, that the cases deserved to be reviewed. That continues to be my position, and I continue to urge the government that such a mechanism should be established. On your first question about what does the majority and the minority community stand to gain from a transitional justice process, I appreciate it particularly because it allows me to insist on a point that I think has been lost in the course of the politicization of the discussions about transitional justice in Sri Lanka. The minority communities that have suffered violations and that have encountered difficulties in finding adequate measures of redress. Think about the difficulties that minority communities have encountered in their interactions with the Sri Lankan courts. The fate of the so-called emblematic cases, most of which remain to be resolved, is an illustration of this fact. Another illustration of the fact is the presence of IDP camps that have been in place for 30 years. And frankly, I must say some of them in conditions that do not befit at all the conditions of displacement camps in a middle-income country as Sri Lanka now is. So there are manifestations of the difficulties that minority communities have encountered across all domains in finding justice. And therefore, it should be obvious what kind of benefits those communities will encounter. There is the crucial question about what the majority stands to gain about this. And this is where I think that it is relevant to remember part of the history in this country and to remember the nature and the fundamental aim of transitional justice. The first cycles of violence in the country were not cycles in which the majority community target a minority. The violence in 1971, the violence between 1987 and 89 in this country those were instances of violence within the majority community. Had the country learned something about comprehensive accountability then, it is very, very likely that the subsequent history would have been different. I insist on the point. This is something that is observable. Wherever human rights on a large scale are violated, no one is safe. The idea that being a member of a particular group, including the majority, is sufficient to guarantee one's safety was, of course, systematically belied by the events in 1971, in 1987 through 1989, and in other events. So the majority community stands to gain the strengthening of a credible system of rights that protects their rights as well. But additionally, and again hearkening to the history of the country, an improvement in the relationship between the different communities is important for everyone. It is, I might add, also important for the armed forces. The armed forces, in my opinion, stand a lot to gain from a transitional justice process. Transitional justice, I will not try to insist, has nothing to do with a witch hunt. It does not involve massive purges. It does not involve the tarnishing of whole classes of people. It does not include the tarnishing of the reputation of an institution or of those that behave legally as members of the institution. So because of all the suspicions and the apprehensions around what really happened at the end of the conflict, what was the behavior of the forces in general, it is particularly important to establish a mechanism that will put some of those questions and some of those doubts to rest. And the only way to do that is through credible investigations, not through political posturing, not by means of the opinions of politicians, but through a credible investigation using sound methodology, having secured access to all the relevant documentation and to all the relevant witnesses, guaranteeing the rights of everyone, both the victims and the accused, and then making reliable determinations of responsibility. So I think that this is a process from which everyone stands to gain quite a bit. And it is one of the reminders that I am trying to offer to the country as a whole. So thank you very much for this question.
I have one over here and then here and
I'm sorry, I have one question about obligations and political will, which I would like to address. Since you mentioned that you have been to the talk on Friday, I will not elaborate on one of the points too much. The question about political will, to the extent that it is a speculation about someone else's mental state and dispositions, I will not engage in. I can only go on the basis of the evidence that I have. The evidence that I have is of a government that has invited the mandate 5 times over the last 2 years, that has been willing to engage in open and transparent communications, that has been willing to provide me with information that I have requested. And on that basis, I have been willing to visit the country 5 times. Now, it goes without saying, the ultimate test of what we familiarly call political will is manifested in decisions, in actions, not in conversations. So it remains to be seen, because so much remains to be done, what the ultimate degree of political will was. But for my part, I take it as a manifestation of seriousness and interest that the government has had an interest to engage with my mandate on 5 different occasions. Now, as to the other point on the obligation to accept whether the recommendations are obligatory, the short answer to that question is it is absolutely correct to say that the recommendations of special procedures are not legally binding. There is no contract, there is no agreement between member states and the instruments of the special procedures that makes those recommendations legally binding. So that's the short answer. The longer answer would involve considerations about the fact that the special procedures are meant to be instruments that accumulate a certain degree of expertise, of comparative judgments, and that can be helpful in bringing to bear to a country not a solution that is designed abroad, but lessons about what has learned better or worse in different country situations that have faced analogous challenges. But to be perfectly honest, I think that this is a debate that is not of utmost seriousness. I think that everyone understands what the nature of the exchanges really are. Thank you very much.
Adam from BBC Business Service. I have 2 questions. One is about you spoke about the case presented in Brazil in general. What do you think of these kind of universal cases? How that affects? And the second question is that you spoke about the statement where Sri Lankan government leaders continues to make war heroes will never be brought to trial. So did you speak to the President Sirisena or the Prime Minister who keeps continuing saying this in your meeting with him?
So thank you very much. On the universal jurisdiction cases, And of course, I will not say anything about the merits of any particular case of which I am not at all a part. So the following comments have nothing to do with this particular case. I will make rather a more general statement. Learning the competencies to bring a case, a criminal case in a foreign jurisdiction against a third party, in other words, someone that is neither a citizen of that jurisdiction or even necessarily present in that jurisdiction. These are not easy skills to get. Once they are acquired, however, they can be replicated. The exercise can be replicated fairly easily, and the choice of jurisdictions is immense. So the only thing that can be said with total certainty is that the case presented in Brazil against a former member of the Sri Lankan Armed Forces is the tip of an iceberg. That predictably you can expect many cases of this sort in the future. And these are cases that will be complicated to run, the cumulative effect of which at the international level, and for example at the level of press reporting, at the level of the foreign perception of the armed forces as a whole, will, I think, be very, very costly. This is one more reason why I think that the best alternative from the standpoint of the armed forces as well is for a credible, reliable, transparent, rule of law based, human rights enhancing accountability procedure to be established in Sri Lanka. Nothing else would offer legal certainty. I said before, and it gets me to the first part of your question, the promise that war heroes will always be completely shielded even from investigation is a promise that, strictly speaking, has a legal dimension that can only be determined by the appropriate organ of the judicial system, in the Sri Lankan case, the Office of the Attorney General. Whether to proceed with an indictment or not in this system is a question for the Attorney General to decide. In most cases in which there is a division of power between executive, legislature, and the judiciary, promises made even by the political leadership about the fate of legal cases constitute, of course, a violation of the autonomy and the independence of judicial powers. So it seems to me that that is a promise that would be very, very difficult to fulfill. What is interesting for me to think about is what drives the need to make a statement of that sort. And in a context in which the discussion about transitional justice is already very deeply politicized and very deeply polarized, it is a statement that is not made in a vacuum, but will be in a particular context. And what I would like to suggest is that a proper understanding of the transitional justice project, including, as I have reiterated several times before, that it is not anything resembling like a witch hunt, that it is completely centered on the idea of enhancing human rights. A proper understanding of this should make it less necessary for anyone to make statements of this sort. The idea that war heroes will not be investigated is not, and a debate about this is of course one that has been engaged by many different parties. And I note with satisfaction both that the need for that in some ways have declined, and that very, very prominent people have said, of course, there is a difference between a war hero, someone that displayed extraordinary courage while being, while attaching his behavior to all the relevant standards, including the laws of war, and people who, in the course of fighting, violated the laws of war, in which case their qualification in Europe is to be disputed. So I think that reintroducing some of the subtleties and proper understanding of transitional justice would save everyone the need to engage in debates at that level of generality. And this is part of what I would like to do in offering these reminders.
From Transfest. You're talking about Sri Lanka underutilizing the expertise of the UN, and do you have any particular kind of expertise in mind when you talk about the need for Sri Lanka to draw more from the UN?
Yeah, so of course, because the special procedures, although not a part of the Office of the High Commissioner, are supported by the Office of High Commissioner, I have a particularly close view of how the Office operates, both generally and particularly in Sri Lanka. I have, of course, interacted very, very closely both on issues having to do with Sri Lanka and other country experiences with different parts of the system. So I think that I have an impression of the stock of expertise that resides in different parts of the system. But they're talking about transitional justice, most particularly residing in OHCHR. That seems to me to constitute a resource from which the country can draw further, much more proactively, as it moves through the different stages of the transitional justice and implementation.
Are you talking about investigative expertise or legal expertise, or what branch of expertise are you talking about?
I am actually making a very broad statement that would include those and others. I think that there is, of course, HCHR in different parts of the world, very, very deep expertise in monitoring human rights situations. But beyond that, there is a great capacity on transitional justice issues that can be put to much better use in the country than it has. Transitional justice is one of the staples of work of the Office of the High Commissioner. In fact, OHCHR is the designated point within the UN system for transitional justice issues. And given the interest and the urgency of the topic in this country, and given that there is a very active and useful UN presence to begin with, the point is to encourage the country to make the best possible use of the resources that are available. And I will not speak for the resident coordinator, but I have reasons to think that this may be true in ways that goes beyond the expertise that OHCHR may offer. But there is both a stock of knowledge, a stock of expertise, and tremendous goodwill on the part of the country team as a whole towards making the best possible use of opportunities and to giving the best response to the needs that arise in Sri Lanka.
Have one more here and then we can come back.
With regard to the right here he said that there is no progress on the accountability front. And you today said that accountability will be sought either here or abroad. Is that UN has suffered its stance on Sri Lanka, and with regard to this government, what is your immediate recommendation, advice for them with regard to the accountability? Where they should start, right?
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think that I would describe the situation as a changing position at all on the part of the United Nations with regards to Sri Lanka. I think that the United Nations, as frankly most parts of the international community, but also most parts of Sri Lankan civil society and sectors of government acknowledge that we are not in this process where we thought 2 years ago we were going to be. And that this can be reduced to a question of fact. The first resolution that was adopted at the Human Rights Council on this topic was a resolution that had a 2-year time frame. So a resolution co-sponsored by Sri Lanka estimated that within a 2-year time frame, the 4 different commitments that the resolution mentions work on the disappeared through the establishment of the OMP, the establishment of a truth-seeking mechanism, the establishment of a reparations office, and the establishment of an accountability mechanism, that those were things that were going to be done within a 3-year period. Now there is a question about whether that should have been a longer time frame or not. But again, coming back to the questions of facts, the fact was that this is the time frame that the government of Sri Lanka set for itself. And as we know, this led to a second resolution rolling over the commitments for 2 additional years. So it's not really a question about where the UN stands with respect to this. Is the facts themselves speak about the fact that everyone expected us to be much farther ahead than we are. And now the fundamental question is, what is to be done about that? I happen to think that it is absolutely imperative to come up with a comprehensive plan that includes reference to the 4 different elements of a comprehensive transitional justice policy, that avoids dealing with them as if they were totally isolated initiative, each of them obeying a totally unpredictable calendar, a set of political constraints, supporters and opponents. No, this should be part of a comprehensive policy, and that comprehensive policy should include everything that demonstrates serious planning when you are talking about governmental action. Serious planning in a government-led program includes things like budgeting, staffing needs, and an assessment of the skill sets that are necessary for those institutions to perform their functions well. And in those cases in which skills are missing, provisions and plans about how those deficits are going to be filled. So I am talking about the urgency of coming up with such a plan. It will help guide expectations. It will help guide to channel resources support and attention in a systematic rather than in a completely divided way. And I think that this is one important contribution that could be made for the advancement of the process. Now, this also helps resolve questions about accountability. The ultimate aim here has to be what is the best accountability mechanism that is capable of reliably resolving justice claims, and to do so in a way that is trustworthy for all communities. This debate, unfortunately, in the case of Sri Lanka, centered very, very rapidly on the question about the nationality of the judges in a possible accountability mechanism. This, for me, is a fundamental mistake. This is a question that should have been approached essentially from the standpoint of the skill sets in order for an accountability mechanism to work properly. And this requires a whole set of skills that need to be cultivated, because frankly, I do not think that the country has enough of, and I think that the government officials would acknowledge that this is the case. There is nothing peculiar about Sri Lanka in this case. There are very few countries that have cultivated the skills to deal, for example, with a large-scale massive violations until they need to do so. So I have insisted again and again, reaching agreements with countries that would be willing to provide a capacity building to Sri Lankans on police investigations, on forensics, and on the articulation of prosecutorial strategies will be fundamental regardless of the shape of any accountability mechanism that may be established in the future. And because those skills are not acquired overnight, these are agreements. This is a process that should start immediately. So work on accountability is not only work on the design of a future accountability mechanism. Work on accountability needs to start with establishing the preconditions for the reliability of any such procedure. And since that is a process that takes time, rather than spending months debating questions in a sort of abstract way about the nationality of the judges, I would get to the business of actually making some achievements in the acquisition of skills that are absolutely indispensable for being able to operate accountability mechanisms in the way that they should. The other point that I will emphasize is the following. Accountability is one part of a transitional justice policy. And I mean it in these two ways. First, it's a part that has to figure in a transitional justice policy. Truth, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence are not substitutes for accountability. These four elements are nothing akin elements in a menu from which you can pick and choose. They are commitments to the four sets of measures. Now, having said that, at the same time, I would like to insist no one should forget that accountability also needs to be supplemented by other measures, because the redress that victims are entitled to as a question of rights also goes beyond criminal justice procedures against some. Their livelihoods need to be improved. the fate of the victims needs to be clarified. And everyone, victims and others, deserve to live under institutions that are not at risk of repeating the violations yet again. So thank you very much for this.
I have just one more here, which was a second question. So is there anyone, is it a first question? Second. Okay, we'll take one, two. Anyone wanting to ask the first question? Okay, so 1, 2, 3. And then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
What's your opinion of new constitution process in Sri Lanka? Former president also against, and especially Askiri and Malwatha chapter already said last Wednesday, no need new constitution for Sri Lanka. So what's your opinion?
There are parts of the discussion about constitutional reform that have important overlaps with the constitutional justice project, but I think that that's a slightly separate conversation. About the debate on the general need for a new constitution, I think that lies beyond the realms of the mandate, and I will simply say there are very important changes that the country is undertaking in many different ways, some of them through legal reforms, some of them through the creation of new institutions. The reform of the Constitution is being explored. I simply want to state the support of the mandate for processes of the renewal of institutions that would offer better guarantees for rights that were violated in the past and better assurances that those rights will not be violated in the future. But I don't think I want to be drawn into a debate about the need for a new constitution.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question. The international community is well informed about the tug-of-war between Catalonia and Spain. Now, this situation will bring bad lessons to Sri Lanka. Will it bring bad lessons to Sri Lanka?
Okay, let's just take the last question here.
You had mentioned that the ODOs is legally unenforceable political statement. At your meeting with President, have you mentioned about it to President, and what's his response? In this backdrop, can people expect genuine reconciliation process and independent legal process in this whole situation?
The conversation with the President was about the importance and the urgency of a transitional justice program, a comprehensive transitional justice program. It was not really about particular expressions that have been used in order to discuss the topic. So, in that respect, this is all that I would say about that. About whether under these circumstances there are reasons to believe that this is something that we move ahead. I simply reiterate the point that I made earlier. I do not go on in the course of the work of the mandate on the basis of my guess about someone else's mental states and degree of commitment. I go simply on the basis of the evidence that is offered to me in terms of collaboration and interest. And so far, I have to say, it has been unusual. It is not very usual for a special procedure to receive repeated invitations to the same country, and therefore, on that basis, I can speak of continued engagement and interest. Having said that, I also reiterate that the ultimate test of this political will in the end is shorthand that we use, all of us, in order to talk about a much more complex phenomenon, which is whether in the end something comes about or not. So in the end, what comes about from this process, which includes my conversations, but of course many other things that are crucially important for the process, including the activism of civil society, their willingness to organize themselves, the work that they did in the course of the CTF, the advice that different countries through their embassies and different ministries offer to the government, the advice and support that the UN gives to the country, and of course the willingness of different instances within government to pull the resources together and move the agenda forward. This is what will determine in the end what will happen here, and as the saying goes, the proof is in the pudding. It remains to be seen. I'm not sure that there was a question about Catalonia, or simply the statement that this is something from which negative lessons will be learned. I actually think that a proper understanding of that history will actually is one from which very important lessons about the relationship between democracy and decentralization can be drawn, but that is a completely different story and a much longer conversation. So.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there's no more questions, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, and it's always a pleasure to take your questions and think them through, because indeed, like all of